This evening's book talk. I'm Gary Chin. I'm the Public Relations and Development Manager for the libraries, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's book talk, 19th Century China and Japan Through American Eyes. Our speaker tonight will be Gillian Bickley, editor of this work, of the book tonight, and has spent many years working with primary materials from the 19th century history. She's the author of The Stewards of Borthry Bush, 2003, and The Golden Needle, the biography of Frederick Stewart, 1836 to 1889, published in 1997, and editor of The Complete Court Cases of Magistrate Frederick Stewart, 2008. Magistrates Court in 19th Century Hong Kong, Court in Time, 2005, second edition, 2009. The Development of Education in Hong Kong, 1841 to 1897, published in 2002, and Hong Kong Invaded, a 97 nightmare, published in 2001. She's also well-published and prize-winning poet, translated into many languages. And with her husband, Vern Bickley, she is the founder of 2 annual international literary prizes, the Provost Prize for Book-Length Work, awarded since 2009, and the Provost Poetry Prize for Single Poems, awarded since 2016. Basically, tonight's book, the eyewitness accounts of early Western democracy, military intervention, tourism, and trade in China and Japan. I think I will save information about the book to Gillian, and I won't delay her any longer. So if you please welcome Gillian Bickley.
Thank you very much, Gary. And thank you very much to everybody for coming. I look forward to introducing to you this book, an interesting set of diaries, mainly about China, to some extent about Japan, published some months ago, a century and a half after being written. So if anybody here is an aspiring author, don't despair. 150 years later, you may be published. Hopefully sooner, but... So as you know from the title of the talk, the diaries of those George Washington Farley Heard, not George Washington. He was a charming, conscientious and cultured personality, an accomplished writer who appears in print under his own name for the first time in this book. I'm going to structure the presentation as follows. First, a brief introduction to Augustine Heard and Company. Second, a brief introduction to George Heard. Then I'll explain how the book came into being. Then Dr. Vern Bickley will read 3 passages from the journals, so you can have a taste of them yourself. I'll then follow by showing background illustrations, including George Heard's own small drawings from the journals. Finally, it'll be your turn to make comments and ask any questions, and maybe you can help answer some questions that I have myself. George Heard was the youngest of 4 nephews of Augustine Heard, who in 1840 founded a new China trade company, Augustine Heard and Company, in Canton. Prior to this, Augustine had been a partner in America's premier China trading entity, Samuel Russell and Company. In 1841, Augustine's nephew, John Heard, went out to Canton to join the company, and in turn, 3 of his brothers, Augustine Heard Jr., Albert Heard, and George Washington Farley Heard, the writer of these journals, took turns to work for their uncle's business in the Far East. Augustine Heard and Company was one of the 2 largest American China trading companies during the 1840s and 1870s. Its trading activities covered the import into China of opium from India, cotton from the USA, and rice from Siam and Taiwan, and the export from China of teas and silks to Europe and the USA. Other activities included shipping, insurance, and the transport of Chinese labor to the Californian gold fields. In Hong Kong, the company engaged in engineering work and owned the Novelty Iron Works, which among other things supplied cannon for the Macau fort, and they also owned the Wan Chai steam bakery. By the second half of the 1840s, its profits were running in excess of $50,000 a year, and by the end of the 1850s, around $200,000 a year. I don't know what you should multiply by, but something terrific. After the firm entered the Yangtze River port trade, which in 1862 generated profits of around $200,000 a year, its total annual profits in the 1860s were over $400,000. But in 1874, the company went bankrupt. Their agent for US business had been consistently dishonest, perpetrating fraud, and the company could see no solution which would not itself lead to bankruptcy. So I'm talking this evening about writing by the member of a family firm that ceased to exist over 140 years ago. To some extent, however, traces of its business activities remain, to the continued, flourishing existence of two of the major institutions of the British China trade, Jardines and Swires. For Augustine Heard Company played crucial roles in the early development of each of these British businesses. When, during the First Opium War, British businesses were not allowed to trade directly with China, Jardine's appointment of Heard's, an American company, as their agent enabled Jardines to continue to be active in the China trade. And in 1861, Augustine Heard Company introduced John Swire and Sons to the China trade when they become their agent. Perhaps nothing ever really dies. George Heard was a young man of 22 or so when he set out for Hong Kong and China to take his turn working for his uncle's business. A personable young man, as you see from the cover of the book, he impressed a fellow traveller, the American minister tasked with visiting Beijing to ratify the Treaty of Tientsin, Mr. John E. Ward. Minister Ward invited George to join the American delegation as an attaché, most properly saying he should first seek the permission of his eldest brother, John. George accepted, and these journals are the result. The journals describe the trip of the American Legation to Beijing, negotiations with Mandarins, and a close encounter with the Tartar army on the way. The June 1859 Battle of the Peiho, when the British suffered a severe defeat. A journey to Japan, again with the American minister, and the following year, 1860, a return visit to China, also with the American minister John Ward, when George records the preparations for the return battle, which the British and their allies this time won. George Heard's comments are those of a young person eager to experience and record everything, and sympathetic to those he met, whatever their station in life and whatever their position in the conflicts that he saw. His eldest brother, John, took his account to be completely authentic, and so it seems did the American minister, who used one of George's accounts as the basis for a dispatch to the President of the USA. When later you hear Verner Bickley read extracts from the journals, you'll be able to experience their quality for yourselves. But first, I want to explain how this book came into being. The original material that now first sees the light of public day under the writer's name in this book is part of a huge archival collection. There are 660 rows of microfilm from the original records. They're known as the Heard Family Business Records, and they're located in Baker Library, Harvard Business School, USA. I first came across the collection in the 1990s when I was working on the biography of Frederick Stewart, which Gary mentioned earlier. That book, The Golden Needle, was published in 1997. 7 years later, I was asked to consider how the Heard family business records might be brought to the attention of scholars and mined for the understanding they could bring of many aspects of trade, of diplomatic and mercantile relations between China and the West during the 19th century. Accessibility seemed to be the key, accessibility to the materials, and accessibility to the contents through the production of readable copies. As for the accessibility of the materials, two measures were thought of. One was to bring a copy of the 660 microfilm rolls to a university library in Hong Kong or the Public Records Office in Hong Kong, where I thought there would be more doctoral and postdoctoral students strongly motivated to work with the materials. But this attempt was not successful. On the other hand, could the entire 660 rows of microfilm be digitized and hopefully made clearer and then made available? If the entire collection could be produced in digitized or text format, the research that could be unlocked could be tremendous. Huge amount of material, hardly used at all. Since I began on this work, a small amount of these materials has been digitized and put online by the Baker Library. Perhaps over time, more will become available in this way. The second goal was to secure readable copies of the entire materials. This task also has not been successful, shall we say, yet. But the book I'm introducing tonight, Through American Eyes, is the first fruits of that desire. So far, the sole, easily readable body of text from that part of the entire Heard family business records, first created in manuscript form, is what you find in this book, Through American Eyes. If anybody asks me in the question and answer session the constraints hindering the second part, the second goal, the production of readable copy, I will let you know. What I did manage to do was, with the encouragement of George Catherley, who's contributed a preface, the constant support of Verner Bickley, and the work of Mrs. Chris Duggan, who did the initial transcription of most of the journals published here, but who first transcribed other parts from the Heard family business records. Over time, it became clear that in the absence of bringing a copy of the entire collection in Hong Kong, the task would need to be made very, very much smaller. Was there any part of the whole, discrete in itself, that could be rendered into readable form and made the basis of a publication? A careful study of the Baker Library finding aid to the Heard collection suggested the materials that have now been published. So a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of work has gone into this, and I hope you will consider that it's been worthwhile. I'm now going to ask Verner Bickley to read some extracts from the diaries. The first describes from the American point of view events during the Battle of the Peiho, in which the Americans compromised their neutral status by helping the British, who had previously offered to assist them when they'd run aground.
The British wanted to go upriver to Beijing to ratify their treaty with China, but found their way barred by barriers erected within the river. This passage describes what happened when they began to remove the barriers. No movement was made until 2:30 p.m. on either side, when the plover, followed by the kestrel and cormorant, steamed up by the first barrier to the second and commenced pulling up the stakes. One had already been pulled out, and the second one loosened when at 2:40 p.m. the middle fort number 3 fired a heavy gun at the plover. The fire was returned by the cormorant, and the cannonading became general throughout the forces on both sides. The forts discharged their guns almost as rapidly as the English and did great execution. All the 8 forts opened their fire at nearly the same time, and they all seemed to direct their fire on the admiral's ship, which they distinguished by his square blue flag. The execution by the heavy guns of the forts was terrible. The men were twice swept away from their quarters on board the plover, and in less than an hour she only had 3 men left. The admiral transferred his flag on board the Opossum, and she was terribly shot. 6 men killed outright, and many more severely wounded. He then went on board the Cormorant, where he remained till night. He himself was severely wounded in the beginning of the action, but like a gallant fellow as he is, refused to be carried below, but remained on deck among his men. The first shot, fired from the forts, took the head off the captain of the plover. Rayson, his name was, and a fine young sailor as I ever saw. He came on board the Taiwan the day previous when we were aground to offer his assistance in the name of the admiral. We found we were just out of range of shot where we were at anchor, and so we remained there. At about 4 p.m., as we were sitting down to dinner, a young fellow from the admiral's ship, the plover, at that time came on board of the Taiwan, told us of the state of things, and asked us for the admiral to assist in towing up the reserve boats of the English. The tide and wind were both against them, and in rowing they would not have been able to reach the scene of battle for a great while. The boats were lying just astern of us, and we were hanging onto the junks. Commodore Tutnell consulted with Mr. Ward, and both concluded to do it, thinking it a course which met with their unqualified approbation. The Commodore then ordered us to the junks, I mean the US Legation to go to the junks, saying a steamer about to tow up the English boats into the middle of the fire was not the proper place for Mr. Ward when the English and French ministers were both aboard their respective vessels 10 miles off. As the order was peremptory, we were obliged to obey, and the barge pulled us on board. The Taiwan then towed up the boats of the English and anchored herself between the Nosagari and the Coromandel, both of whom were firing very rapidly. The Taiwan remained there 3/4 of an hour, and while in that position, the Commodore went to pay a visit to the Admiral to offer his sympathy to a wounded brother officer who was severely wounded and who was suffering a mortifying defeat. He pulled up in the middle of one of the hottest fires that ever came from the forts, and when nearly alongside of the Cormorant, the ship on which the Admiral was at that time, a shot struck his boat, knocking the stern sheets out of it, throwing the Commodore and Lieutenant Trenchard out of their seats and killing the coxswain. They paddled up to the Cormorant on the debris of the boat and found the Admiral lying on the deck, and heads, arms, and legs lying around on the deck, lying around in every direction, and the decks were streaming with blood. While the Commodore was on board, a lieutenant was brought up dead and laid on deck, and 2 men were struck down at a gun. An English boat came alongside at the time, and the officer in charge offered to take the Commodore and his barge's crew back to the Taiwan. 3 of the barge's crew could not be found in the excitement. They came back to the Taiwan in the middle of the night, and when asked where they had been, they replied that they found themselves in the way, and they thought their only way to get out of the way was to go to the guns. There's much more to this account, and hopefully you may want to read it for yourselves. In contrast, there are 2 shorter passages. One is from George Heard's account of the journey by land to Beijing, and the other about his time in Japan, again traveling with the American minister. From the journey by land to Beijing, we were nearly 3/4 of an hour getting out of Tongchao and passed through a second high gateway into the open country, which was charming. There were many groves of trees, large and graceful in shape, broad fields of millet and corn, and here and there little enclosures filled with trees and shrubs, beneath which were mounds of earth, half covered with grass and flowers. These were the cemeteries. The Chinese have a great reverence for the dead, and their burial places are often very tastefully arranged. Here and there we could see joss houses and temples, and frequently passed buildings like towers with 4 pillars. Inside and between the pillars were huge figures of turtles. I was told they were erected by one of the emperors during a visit south to commemorate his journey. Our path lay on the top of this great causeway, and this causeway of stone, which was almost as level as a railway. In former times, when the Great Wall was in its infancy, this must have been a magnificent road, as good in fact as the Appian Way. And now from George Heard's visit to Japan. Often, when a customer goes into a shop, the Japanese bring him confectionery, etc., 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 etc. There was one shop in Nagasaki where I often went and bought things because people were so kind. As soon as I entered the shop, a little girl, 6 years old, came up and offered me some confectionery on a piece of paper. Then another one came with a big square bottle of sake, the Japanese wine. She was followed by a boy with a basket of gingerbread, and a little child about 18 inches high, who could hardly walk toddled up with a sugar fish painted green as a kumshor. So I sat down, cross-legged, on the clean mat floor, and all this family around, and we had a regular family meeting. They seemed as glad to see me as if I was the prodigal son returned from his wanderings. I gave them in return a lot of bright new navy buttons I had bought off the purser, at which they were highly delighted and thanked me by raising the buttons to their foreheads and bowing very low. This is but one instance of the kind good nature of this people. Over and over again, I have entered shops for the first time and had sake and cakes offered me. The cakes are usually accompanied by bits of dried fish, which are not to be eaten, but are connected with some legend relative to the origin of their empire.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me just switch you off there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Switch burner off. Now I have to switch myself back on again. Am I back on? Yes, I am. So I think you'll agree that the descriptions are lively, charming, and interesting, and they give a very nice impression of the personality of George Heard. Remember, he was a very young man. He was 22, 23, first time in the Far East. Now, I'm going to show you some slides, and they will to some extent revisit what's already been said, but also give you more details about George Heard's journeys. After I've done that, please give me comments, perhaps give me some suggestions, and I'll try to answer any questions. So, this is actually a miniature. It's come out extraordinarily well, because it's very, very tiny. The original is very, very tiny. The first time that my husband saw this portrait, he said, "A proud young man." And I think when you look at it, you'll feel that he's very proud of himself. And it's very interesting. When he was appointed attaché to the American Legation, the first thing he seems to have been concerned about was whether he could have a uniform. He was very disappointed because the American minister had not bought any uniform, and they had to cobble it together in some way. And then later, he was appointed secretary to the legation, and then he had a short sword. He sent away immediately to London to get the correct uniform, so he enjoyed his position. A different image of the same person. Can we recognize him as the same man? Later, he became a director of Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. He was deputy chairman and chairman for a year or so. Remember, there were 4 brothers. This is one of his older brothers, who also was a director of HSBC. I think the 2 of them took it in turns to be a director. And this is another view of the same man. How we change. Now, to demonstrate the importance of Augustine Heard Company, this was their house in Canton during that particular period. Perhaps I should just mention, we can't photograph the images because they're copyrighted. But if anybody needs an image for anything later, please let me know, and I'll let you know how to get it. So later, George Heard was the manager at the branch in Canton. This was their residence in Shanghai. This is a photograph this time of the same house. Another picture. So if there's many pictures of the same subject from an early period, it means that it was thought to be important. So it's the white building in this one. This is what Shanghai was like, a little bit later than the period we're talking about. There are some very detailed descriptions of the buildings in my source, which is one of Martin Gregory's catalogues, auction catalogues. So if anybody really, really wants to know, we need to look at the catalogue. This is the Heard flag. It looks rather rough and ready, but map of Shanghai about the same time. Again, if anybody was really interested, there is a lot of detail that you could see if I were to enlarge it. So this is the building in Hong Kong. I think you're beginning to recognize where it is today. Another version of it, the same building. Photograph this time. Another photograph, see it in front of the cathedral. It's where it still is. And this was Hong Kong at about that period. If anybody again wants to know the specific buildings, they're there at the bottom. You can have a look. Now this is the ship on which George Heard wrote his journals. And this is his very best handwriting. I say that because it looks quite easy to read, but actually the manuscript is very difficult to read. But this, I think, is his best handwriting. He seems to have taken notes and then written up the journal afterwards. We know that because at one point he said that his notebook had been stolen from the ship. I don't know whether he ever got it back again or whether he recreated his notes from memory. And this is a steamer which is mentioned frequently. You can see the American flag on it. So in the journal, there are very tiny little drawings. And I'm very proud of myself for noticing these tiny little drawings. They're really very, very small. But they've come out. If you look hard, you can see what they are. So this shows us the things that particularly struck him on his journey that he thought he could draw. So here are some islands. Bigger version of the same. So I'm giving the dates so you can follow the journey partly through the dates. Now the stakes that Werner read about across the Peiho River. So this is a picture of a stake. You can see it, right? And this is his drawing of the Peiho forts, and we see he's numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And his drawing, though crude, is not so inaccurate because this is a picture, a drawing of somebody else's. It's an engraving from somebody else's drawing of the forts, perhaps somewhat romanticized. And this is what they look like today, or 2006. Here's a painting of the bombardment, presumably part of what Werner was reading. Again, this is a very, very detailed. This isn't by. If it's by George Heard himself, I mentioned journal entry. Otherwise, it's another source which I found to help illustrate the text. So there's very detailed explanation of which all the ships were. So if anybody really is interested, it's there in the book. This probably was drawn by George Heard himself. He mentions mud, and we know that the British Marines, rushing to storm the forts, got trapped in mud, terrible, terrible mud. Their rifles got wet, so they couldn't be used. And they were mostly shot down before they could reach the shore because they were in this mud. Here's another, not quite the same. Some more forts. But he's not good at drawing, which is better than I would be. And again, so his picture of the forts, and here's somebody else's professional artist picture. So the Americans, of course, were not part of the battle. They were watching the battle. And in the passage that was read, we saw that they compromised their neutrality by helping the British. They were asked to take the boats into the action, which they shouldn't have done. And legend has it that Commodore Tucknell said, anybody here know what he said?
Blood is heavier than water.
Thank you. Blood is thicker, perhaps. Blood is thicker than water. Whether
Right.
Heard doesn't record that, but this is what everybody knows, right? That apparently Tucknell said, blood is thicker than water. It's very obscure, so if we look at it literally, what does it mean? But what he meant was, we're going to help the British. So then, after that, the Americans were a little bit nervous that maybe the Chinese would refuse to deal with them because they had compromised their neutrality and helped the British. But after all, the Chinese side won the battle. In any case, they negotiated with the people on the land to try to get permission to go to Beijing themselves. And at this stage, they were taken by boat and cart, an interesting way for travelling, to have an interview with the Governor General of the province of, however you pronounce it, Petrolina. I don't know if you can see that particularly well. It's a Chinese artist reproduced from Reverend Martin's book, A Cycle of Cathay. It doesn't purport to be a description of this event, but it might give us some idea of what that event looked like. So we see the mandarins on shore, and we see foreigners in boats. And these are the carts. So what you had to do, he describes it very carefully what you had to do. You had to get into the cart head first and lie down at full length on a sort of mattress. So it was most uncomfortable. That was how they journeyed. Now, I don't know whether the person they met was Viceroy Tan, but this is a picture, again, in Reverend Martin's book, A Cycle of Cathay, round about that period. So we see the mandarins, retinue, and we see, I suppose, the Americans. Again, it's a Chinese artist. So they got permission, they waited for quite a while, and they got permission to go to Beijing. They hadn't done anything wrong. Beijing was happy for them to go. And they went by road, again in those carts, excruciatingly uncomfortable. George Heard tells us that there were great holes in the road, and that the cart would go down into the hole, and then up again. And it was really the most uncomfortable journey he'd ever had. But then, fortunately, they could continue by river. And these are some of the things he drew on his way. The northern granaries, and then he was interested in the peacock feather as a symbol of status. He gives a list of the different buttons and what status they were in the book. I don't know whether you can see a conical hat with a button. This isn't just scribbling. It's supposed to be a conical hat with a button. You see the word conical straw hat, and then squiggly with a button. That's the hat. Then we have ladies' hairstyle. He didn't like the hairstyle very much. And here we have lady's foot at the bottom. He says their feet are not bigger than an apple. But they can walk very easily. A bridge over a branch of the Peiho River. Again, the Chinese artist showing them going up the river. Can you actually distinguish it to some extent? So we see flags flying. It's very, very faded in the book. He draws an emblem on the imperial colours. Can you see that? You have to sort of look a bit hard. And then we have them going by road. The embassy to Peking. He noticed, very interestingly, that the Beijing gate with holes for cannon, a lot of them were painted with gun muzzles, so that they didn't actually have enough guns, but some of them did have guns. And so we can contrast this with a photograph not so many years later. So this is his drawing, and this is a photograph of a gate in Beijing. And that little squiggle, I don't know why he found that particularly interesting, but 2 gates with a courtyard between the two, and he drew that. Well, having got to Beijing, it seems that they weren't really allowed out of the residence that they were assigned to live in. This was because the American minister thought it wasn't polite for them to go into the city until he had met the emperor. But in order for him to meet the emperor, he had to agree to perform a kowtow, which he refused to do. There's a lot of negotiation about this, and finally, one of the mandarins negotiating said, you know, we have to kowtow before the emperor. It has religious significance. Well, that finished it from the point of view of the Americans, because they couldn't possibly kowtow before the emperor if it had religious significance. So no. So then the meeting couldn't take place. And because the meeting couldn't take place, the American legation couldn't go out into the city. So George Heard was immensely disappointed, because on his way to Beijing he said, the city of all places in the world that I wanted to visit. But he couldn't go out at all. He was able to go on the roof once and have a little look. It seems that this prohibition didn't extend to the servants, because one of the servants went out and came back with a report. And the report was that Beijing wasn't much of a place. There weren't many fine shops in it. So, at that time. So, no meeting with the emperor, no ratification of the treaty, and the American legation went back. On the way back, they were again by river. Probably all of you know this, but I was quite astonished to know that the ships were dragged by people on the river. They didn't go under their own steam or engine or oars or anything. They were pulled by people. And this little squiggle, it shows the end of the boat and a mast and 2 bits of rope, and people pulled the rope. Now, fortunately, I have another picture of it from a much later period. We see the people pulling the boat down the river. I don't know whether you saw, a few years ago in the Morning Post, there was a picture, a contemporary picture of people doing that. And it said that the Chinese government was thinking of adding this as a tourist attraction, that they would be doing it again today. But I've seen nothing further about that. So the American legation arrived back at Penang at this date, and without any formality, the exchange of treaty ratifications was effected with the same official that they had met before. The legation arrived back in Shanghai, one of the wonderful houses that we saw, and went back to the Heard house in the early evening. So, and then for some reason, not explained in the journals, they went to Japan. Fortunately, there was an American minister resident, this fine-looking gentleman, also a proud-looking gentleman. Perhaps that's what you always did if you were having your portrait painted. You were asked to sit in a very proud manner. And he gave George Heard and his companions rooms and a good dinner. George was very interested in food, by the way. Quite a lot of comments on food in his journals. Food he liked, food he didn't like, when there wasn't enough food, when there was plenty of food. And in one description, wonderful description of food, they ate for hours and hours and hours. Girls came with chopsticks and put the food into their mouths. And then he said, nature could no more. He couldn't eat any more. And that he really wished that his stomach was like a sack, so he could continue to put food into his stomach. Remember, he was a young man. Not many drawings about Japan, but here we have a Japanese shoe. He made the comment that he thought the Japanese must be a proud race, because he said all men carried swords. And he felt that that would give men the feeling that they were ready to defend their honor, and so they would be very proud. So then we have another journal describing a second visit to China. And this is the ship on which he traveled for this second journey. By now, George Heard was promoted. He was secretary to the American Legation. Before that, it was the minister's brother who'd been the secretary, but he had resigned and the position was given to George Heard. These are some illustrations of the preparations of the Allies to go to China for the return battle. These from the Illustrated London News. Because of the size of the forces massing to fight the return battle, it seemed to the American minister that it was inevitable that the Allies would win. And so he didn't feel it was appropriate for them to stay and witness the battle as neutral parties. So they left. Nevertheless, on the way back, they called at various places, and George Heard went on shore, walked around the English camps. We saw examples of the English arriving. And he found them the dirtiest places he'd ever seen. Well, here's a different point of view. This is the Illustrated London News picture of British forces. You see, very elegant, lying down, reading a book, etc. So it shows you that different ways of recording the same situations, and a first-hand diary, not for publication, probably gives you a truer picture than an illustration for the country whose troops are fighting in that country, in another country. He went on land to look at a market. He admired the market. This is not that market, but maybe it looks something like this. And the Americans went back to Shanghai, 22nd of August, and the journal ends. And here is Gary holding up a piece of paper for me. So that's the end of the journal.
Thanks, Gillian. We'd like to go into the Q&A session now. So if anyone would like to raise their hand, I'll pass you the mic. And one hand.
That was a wonderful exposition, Gillian. But I have two little questions. You said initially that the Heard's company was established in Canton, but was it actually incorporated there? And I was just curious, 600 rolls of microfilm, how many pages would that be?
I don't know, something tremendous, absolutely tremendous. How many would it be? There could be 600 pages, couldn't there, on a microfilm? It's a vast and huge collection. There's been, I think, one PhD, there's been one book, And I think that's about it. So there it is, waiting for everybody to start work. Most of it, however, is business. There's a lot of business papers, receipts, merchandise, etc., which some people would find fascinating, but it would take a lot of work. But buried among that are narratives like this. Now the fact that it's called Heard Family Business Records obscures the fact that there is a lot of personal correspondence, which is very, very interesting. And there is a lot of correspondence which hasn't been transcribed. We began to transcribe it at first, but then realized how long it would take. So it takes about 30 minutes to do one page, and imperfectly. So you can do one page in 30 minutes, and then keep going, because you can't find it all, because it could have place names or personal names. Haven't got a clue what they are. The writer might not have known how to spell them. So the only way you can research those names is to look at contemporary records, other contemporary records, which have been published and are printed, and then try and compare and contrast the situation to try to work out what the place name is or what the personal name is. And in some cases, quite a few cases, I haven't been successful. So I'm waiting for you to help. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question?
There's a very interesting description of these journals on the wall in 1859. Now, do you know whether there are any other comparable records of the Americans to this detail as George Heard's records?
Such difficult questions. Yes, there are a couple of descriptions. So the rather difficult to see drawings are from a book which has been published, which does have similar records. And there's another one by Samuel Wells Williams, which describes the situation. But in one case, there were interpreters, you see. Samuel Wells Williams was an interpreter on the ship. But at one point, George Heard mentions that he and the others went into the action, but the interpreters stayed where they were. So the interpreters got the information at second hand, whereas he had it at first hand. And then I did mention that the American minister sent one of George Heard's accounts back to the President of the United States as an official report. Doubtless he had to write it out again in a different format. So maybe through that means it has become published in some way. But I could only find those two sources for me to compare and contrast with American sources. And it was great fun to find you. A lot of hard work. More fun to read.
So I have a question about the drawings that you mentioned and you bring up. So I'm curious, in doing your research, how often do these little drawings come out? Is it like a lot, or are they rare instances? And the second part of my question is, in discerning all of the drawings, did any themes emerge on what he would often emphasize on graphically, or anything that he chooses not to emphasize?
Thank you. There was a time when I asked the Baker Library, please to go through this part of the originals, to photograph those little drawings for me. And this isn't going to be recorded. They were obviously horrified. Well, it can be recorded but cut out afterwards. They were obviously horrified at the amount of work that would be necessary, and they said I'd have to hire a student helper to do it. And then I thought, and then that was going to be really quite expensive. So I thought, well, maybe I can just do it myself from the microfilm. And I think probably they wouldn't be very much better, probably, because the ink comes through from the other side in any case. And I counted them at that, I'm coming to the answer. I counted 60 at that point. But when I actually came to work on it, I didn't actually see 60. So I don't quite know whether I missed any the second time through or not, but between 30 and 60 little drawings. I suppose he just drew what he thought he could draw quickly. He also has a drawing of when they had a formal dinner, how the tables were arranged, and he told us who sat at what table, so he was interested in that. Obviously he was interested in people, so the business about the peacock feather and the hair and the feet. And there is one little bit that's in code, which is very interesting. So I thought at first, is this semaphore? No. But fortunately I asked Dr. Stephen Davis, who knows a lot about maritime affairs, and he knew what it was. It's a particular code which apparently is called Pigpen code. And he explained the code to me, but better than that, he read the code for me. And what it said was, see my letter to my brother. So in other words, he didn't include everything in the journal. He wrote a letter, and something else is in the letter. So the next task, if life and time allowed, would be to find the letter. So he was doing a lot of writing. So he wrote letters as well as the journal.
Just very quickly, did you pick up any Chinese?
Nothing said about it. I guess he would have to, wouldn't he? There's a bit of pidgin English in the journals, talking to his servant, I suppose. No. This is the early years, isn't it? So I don't know what happened later. One would assume, yes. He died at a very young age. He became very ill, and you know what happened when you became ill in the Far East? You got on a ship to go back home, hopefully to get better, but he died on the ship. What did he have? He had dropsy. He seems he had dropsy. Maybe he had a heart problem. And maybe all that eating, had led to early death as well. Doesn't really mention drinking, but eating, certainly.
Oh, there must be drinking.
You think there must be? You couldn't eat so much without drinking as well.
And buried at the sea?
No, buried in either Aden or Suez. Aden or Suez, I'm not sure. It's in the book. There was some confusion, but there. Yeah. I don't know that anybody's ever looked for the grave or
Oh, just a short.
anything. Yeah.
Any mention of women in these journals?
Yes. Just talking about, so when they were travelling, either by land or on ship, crowds from the villages were coming out to look at them, these strange people, and women were among them. So that's the only reference to women in the crowd. And little girls, he mentions, well, there's a child in Japan who's mentioned, but otherwise no. I mean, on ships in those days they didn't have women, and it's only the journals. I mean, I haven't transcribed the letters or anything else. They could be in the letters. I can direct you to them if you
Yeah, excuse me. Here. You mentioned the correspondence and all those documents. Do you think the handwriting is easily to be read?
No.
No. Very horrible.
Very, very hard, yes.
No typewriting.
The later period, yes, there is typing, but this particular document, no. And some of it was like carbon, you know. So like five copies really. It's a terribly pale. And
All carbon copy? Some carbon
yes,
copy?
some of them were, yes. This wasn't carbon copy, but the business records include what they call press copies. I suppose it's carbon copy. I could perhaps say something about that. When I was thinking, let's get the whole thing transcribed, and then everybody can do lots of interesting work, because it's a very valuable collection. And I calculated it would take one person 60 years, working half a day. And so then I thought, I spoke to a librarian, and they said, well, yes, there is some software, but it would be 30% accurate only. So then it was suggested to me that I speak to somebody who was an expert in pattern recognition, professor at Baptist University. So I met him. He asked me to send him samples of the material together with my transcript for him to take with him when he went to a conference in Europe to show all the pattern recognition experts in the world. And they said, very difficult. First we have to get rid of noise, and then we have to tackle the handwriting. And then I had a meeting with Kodak, who were very helpful. And this professor asked me to tell him what Kodak said. If Kodak said that technology was not yet far enough advanced, then I needn't speak to him again. And Kodak said, no, it's impossible. Technology can't do it. So back to doing it by human eye and hand. And I was very fortunate. I mean, I asked many people. Many people expressed an interest. Oh, yes, be easy, read the handwriting. And then they were all, sorry, I don't have the patience, or no, I can't do it. But finally, I found one lady who said, yes, I'd love to do it. This is Chris Duggan. And she did sterling work. And she enjoyed it. She really enjoyed it. And she was saying how exciting. Pirates, all sorts of things. And so had she not undertaken the task, we still wouldn't have it. I had to edit it and look at it again myself afterwards. But my courage would have failed me if I'd had to do everything from scratch. So really, we owe it to Chris Duggan that the book has come into existence.
So what was her secret?
Who can tell? She just, that sort of lady. She liked doing it, and she had the skill to do it. Mm. Any other questions?
I may have missed this because I came in a little late, I'm sorry. But how long did it take to complete this volume?
Oh, well, because nobody was doing it all the time. So I think I started 2004, and it was published last November. There was a pause of about 5 years because there was a sponsor, and he wanted a particular photograph from a particular gallery, and the gallery closed for repairs. And the gallery was closed for a number of years. And just by chance, I thought, I've got to finish this. Just by chance, I Googled them. Oh, they're open again. So I used the website to communicate with them, and I got an automatic message which said, we deal with inquiries in the order in which we receive them. So I wrote and I said, I first made this inquiry 6 years ago, or 5 years ago, and so I hope you will consider giving my present inquiry priority. And so they were very helpful. Yeah. So you have to be patient, you have to have time. You don't need to eat from the work. Yeah.
Is there any additional questions? There,
Sorry, I want to say something else. Sorry, Gary. I just want to say this. Okay. So, what physical public reminders are there of the Heard family and of George Heard himself? So, there is a museum in Ipswich, Massachusetts. This is how the website describes it. It's a federal-style structure built in 1795 by John Heard. Mentions his son, Augustine Heard, who is Uncle Augustine to the four brothers, of which George Heard is one, nephew. The court of, when this photograph was taken, it was the Court of Final Appeal. That was the Heard house, but modified, and it wasn't in this format. And another picture of it, when it was the former French mission building. There is a Heard Street in One Shine. Have we ever noticed it? Yes. A Heard Street in One Shine. And the book. And if you want a copy, it's there. So,
yes, and the book is specially priced for this evening.
but it's, yeah.
So it's 200, and that's $50 less than the usual retail price. Okay, well, thank you, Gillian.
Thank you,
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sarah.
And thank you to everyone for coming. As you've noticed, there's a survey sheet on your seat. And if you mind taking a minute or two just to help us complete it, that helps us here at the libraries prepare and understand your feedback for future book talks. Well, if there's nothing else, Gillian will be by the book sale, and I'm sure she'll be willing to sign some. And so please have a wonderful evening. Hopefully the weather will stay with us for a longer period, and it'll be very nice. And thank you for coming, and I say good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.